Greetings, everyone. Peter Maravellis here on behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers and the City Lights Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, the virtual dimension of our events calendar. Tonight, we celebrate the publication of yet another City Lights title. As many of you know, we are a publishing house as well as a bookstore. We have over 200 books in print, from poetry to literature and translation to books on current affairs, always with a progressive political outlook. We publish a variety of titles. We are thrilled to be celebrating the publication of $20 and Change, Harriet Tubman and the Ongoing Fight for Racial Justice and Democracy. It is authored by Dr. Clarence Lusane with a foreword by Kali Holloway. Dr. Lusane is an author, activist, scholar, and journalist. He is professor and former chairman of Howard University's Department of Political Science. He's been a political consultant to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation and a former commissioner for the DC Commission on African American Affairs. He frequently appears on MSNBC and C-SPAN and was invited to the Obama administration to speak at the White House. He's the author of numerous books, including The Black History of the White House, also published by City Lights, I might add. Dr. Lusane lives and works in the Washington, D.C. area. He's going to be joined tonight by Justin Desmangles. A few words about Justin. He is chairman of the Before Columbus Foundation, administrator of the American Book Award, and host of the radio broadcast New Day Jazz. A member of the board of directors of the Oakland Book Festival. Mr. Desmangles is also a program producer at the African American Center of the San Francisco Public Library. So with $20 and Change, Dr. Lusane places Harriet Tubman's life and legacy in the context of a long tradition of resistance, illuminating the ongoing struggle to realize a democracy in which her emancipatory vision prevails. So before we begin, as is customary before each event, I'd like to take this moment to remind everyone, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We would like to take this moment to acknowledge those who have come before us as stewards of the land and offer our respect. Throughout the course of the evening, we will be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of $20 and Change. These will be signed editions, as Mr. Lusane was kind enough to inscribe some plates for us. Also be hosting a Q&A towards the end of the evening. So please do post your questions, your comments, and praise in that same chat function. So without much more ado, please join us in welcoming Dr. Clarence Lusane and Justin Desmangles. Welcome to City Lights, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Peter. And Clarence, thank you for being so generous with your time and sharing your evening with us. In speaking about your new book, $20 and Change, I feel that this comes at a moment in our collective history, not unlike triage, battlefield triage, and that the book itself, your book, $20 and Change, is very much like a laying on of the hands to what is, in fact, sacred wounds. I would like to get into some of the medicinal impulses that may have brought you to this extraordinary work, its continuity and depth in description of struggle towards self-determination. But before we get into that, I'd like to start with something that I think will help us talk in a more concrete way about some of the specifics that you direct our attention to. And that has to do with what has always been, I believe, Uncle Sam's Achilles heel, which has been the historical failure to accept Black leadership in the United States of America, and in particular, Black leadership on the subject of human rights. Now, more poignantly in your authorship, we have the focus here with Harriet Tubman, but more recently in the 20th century, we think of people such as Du Bois and King, leaders who were at one time eager to represent the ideals and the promise of the United States, only to be publicly reviled, and in the case of King, assassinated, in the case of Du Bois, essentially chased out of the country. So with that in mind, perhaps we can begin there. Again, the historical failure to accept Black leadership on the issue of human rights in the United States of America. How does Harriet Tubman fit in with that narrative, and why is it important to revive and resuscitate her image at this critical time?
Thank you for that question, and greetings, everyone. Thank you for coming out and zooming in to this discussion. So that really is a central question to what animated me to write the book. First, let me explain the title, $20 and Change. That comes from the decision in the last year of the Obama administration by the Treasury Department to replace Harriet Tubman on the front of the $20 bill and to move Andrew Jackson to the back. There's still an effort to try to get Jackson off altogether, but that putting her on the $20 bill raised all kinds of issues. What symbolism mean? How does narrative operate? Are we seeing honoring or are we seeing exploitation? And so I wanted to dive into a deeper explanation of both the paths that Harriet Tubman took to not only racial justice, gender equality, but as you indicate more broadly, democracy, relative to and compared to Andrew Jackson, who not only was a slave trader and a slave owner, but was personally involved in massacres of Native Americans. You couldn't find two more different historic figures. And so Harriet Tubman wanted to look at not just what she did during the slave era, but the entire arc of her life, where she was engaged in women's rights, she was engaged in suffrage movement, she had organized to help the poor. So all around effort on her part, which I designate as the struggle for a real, genuine democracy. And so if we look at her life in that light, I think it gives us a much deeper kind of context for looking at, as you point out, what does leadership mean and how does that evolve? And I would argue, again, particularly with African-American women, and you look at Fannie Lou Hamer, for example, in the book with a quote from her, which again is a person who came up from the real oppressive nature in U.S. society and became not just a national voice, but a global voice for human rights, for democracy. And so I wanted to, again, focus on Harriet Tubman at that moment, in this moment, because of what she represented. But then when we look at where we're at today and the paths, the crossroads between expanding democracy or down the path to encroaching authoritarianism, Harriet Tubman, I think, is an icon that we can call upon as inspiring to make sure that we go down the right path and we really do take up the fight against all of the anti-democratic forces that are arrayed against us at the moment.
A moment ago, you mentioned something that I think is critical to our discussion of your book, and that has to do with the elevation of Black leadership to a Black internationalism. That is to say, the articulation of the human rights struggle inside the United States being parallel or united with human rights struggles throughout the world. Now, 50, 60 years ago, the American left was deeply hewn to a similar conception of elevating the civil rights struggle to a human rights struggle. I believe in his final return from the continent of Africa and from some travels in Europe, Malcolm X was particularly focused on this point. That is to say, that the struggle within the United States for Blacks in particular would only be relieved through the unity with Black struggle elsewhere. Is this amplification of Black struggle in the United States part of the reason why Black leadership has been turned around so frequently, whether it's Tubman, or I mentioned Du Bois and King a moment ago, Malcolm X, but also Mary McLeod Bethune and many others. I won't go down the entire roster, but to that question, is that part of the difficulty here, that Black leadership almost invariably elevates the human rights struggle to an international one, something the United States won't countenance?
So I think so. There's a long history of what I would call Black internationalism, going back to even before the U.S. became the U.S.
Yes.
And then you look after the country began in the late 1700s, the Haitian Revolution, which
Right.
was significant not only to people in Haiti, but to people of African descent around the world. And
Yes.
certainly African American leaders in the 19th and 18th century called upon that spirit of revolution that happened in Haiti. And then it continued the development of Pan-Africanism in the last part of the 1900s, and then picked up by everybody from Garvey to Du Bois.
Right.
And also those interactions where Black people traveled and engaged. And the language of human rights became central, particularly as the NAACP developed and the Garvey movement developed in the teens, in the 1920s and 20th century. And Black people were there when the United Nations was being built and being developed. People, everyone from W.B. Du Bois to Paul Robeson to Ralph Bunche to others who saw that it wasn't just a struggle in the US, but it was a global struggle, and that African Americans had to take their struggle, act in solidarity with people, but also use the liberating language of human rights. And that has continued, as you pointed out, it continued in the 1960s, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Angela Davis, others who in that period went to Europe, went to Cuba, went to Africa, and bonded with people around these struggles.
Yeah.
And in the context of all of that, again, I would locate Harriet Tubman, who became really a global figure. As some people know, a lot of the work I do is international. And I lived in Europe, I lived in Latin America, in Asia, and worked with human rights organizations and groups. And much of their attention is focused on African-American struggle for a lot of different reasons, but they're aware of the history, including people like Harriet Tubman. So I think we're not always sensitive to the struggles that are going on globally, but certainly people around the world are sensitive to our struggles. So in part, this book is written not just for a US audience, but for an international audience as well. And particularly acute in this era where we see the attacks on the 1619 Project, the misuse of critical race theory as a means by which to attack any teaching of history, any effort at racial justice. More than ever, we have to reassert what the history of this country is and find ways and means to counter this authoritarian movement that really wants to shut down all of those discussions and all of that history and knowledge.
Well, one of the great elations of experiencing, reading your book comes from the deftness and agility of your own imagination and literary style to connect these stars, offer this constellation, and give us this picture, which you're describing now, in terms of the alignment of international struggle. But you mentioned that some of these facts in recent times, and certainly looking back over the last several centuries, have become obscured largely through the peculiarly American idiom of denial, disavowal, a radical unremembering that is a very engaged process of undoing history, and some attempt described in sort of far right think tank manipulation of history, geography, information to try to guide collectively all of us towards some hideous material goal. So my point here is the American idiom of forgetting, of radical unremembering, of this denial and disavowal. As a Black historian, you're always up against this. Could you talk a little bit about what you've discovered, not just within this book, but within your own experience and researches about how this mechanism works? Because certainly in popular culture, it's wildly effective, but this denial and disavowal here in the United States is more widespread than just popular culture, isn't it, Clarence? Could you talk to us about that?
Sure. So I think there are a couple of things happening. So there's a denial of the history, just simply that it doesn't exist. We will erase it. We will not teach it. Virginia, for example, had just proposed an education curriculum where they're going to talk about slavery, but not talk about racism. How you could possibly do that, I can't even imagine. And then we know in Florida, for example, in Texas, and a number of places where they've described slavery as basically labor coming over from Africa. You know, some very wildly distorted notions. And we have to push back against all of that and put out correctives, because as a professor, I get students who are coming in who are 18, 19, 20, now students who are basically born after 2000. They really are millennial children. And they're not getting this history. They're not getting an overview that really kind of lets people put all of our issues in a historic context. So for example, there's a chapter in the book called From 1619 to COVID-19. And what I talk about in that chapter is the issues that emerged around COVID and race, where we know that brown people, Black people, Native people were not given the kind of access that was deserved and the kind of medical attention that was deserved. But that just didn't start in 2020. There's a long history. Harriet Tubman was injured while she was enslaved when she was a child. She was brutally hit in the head, and it caused her seizures and problems her entire life, which makes it even more remarkable when you think about what she accomplished. But what that tells us is that Black people's lives, Black people's health was not relevant only to the degree that Black people could be used as labor. And so that didn't stop at the end of slavery, but continued through Jim Crow and continued post Jim Crow. We see the disparities, we see that now. And there were a number of African-American doctors who pointed out this history to demonstrate that it wasn't just kind of incidental and it wasn't an occasional individual act, but that it's institutional and systemic. We have to understand that history if we're going to come up with policies and resolutions. We can't think everything just started, a couple of years ago. So, that's one of the things that I, try to do in all of my writings is to give, deep historic context so we can see the evolution of these relationships, the evolution of these histories, even with the issue of Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. Did not start with the Obama administration, but you could go back decades where there were women who were raising issues of why were there only men on the U.S. currency. Black people were raising issues about some of the symbols that represented racism in the country. So there's a long history, again, that we're often not aware of, but really is important to understand these phenomena.
One of the sharp and well-defined points that emerges from your vivid portrait of Tubman is an education for your readers that she was among the many roles that she played in her life was also a brilliant militant strategist, or more specifically, a military strategist, and recently so honored here in the United States for her work in espionage. Could you talk to us a little bit about Tubman as a military strategist and the complexity of being honored in the contemporary world for her work in espionage, because there's quite a bit of luminous contradiction, let's call it, within that.
Okay, so one of the things we should remember is that all the way until the end of the Civil War, Harriet Tubman was a wanted fugitive. So any step she took into the South was at risk of being captured and put it back into slavery. But when the war, as the Civil War broke out, she initially volunteered and then later was contracted in a number of positions. She was a nurse, she was a cook, she did all kinds of work, but she also played a military leadership role. She was asked at one point to lead a convoy of hundreds of soldiers down the Combahee River to basically push back the Confederates that were gathered in the area, and then to rescue people who were enslaved. She rescued about 700 or 800 people who were enslaved. They just went down the river, and military drove the Confederate back. And she was the first woman, not Black or white or anything. She was the first woman to lead a military expedition, and a successful one at that. As a result of that, she was honored, which many would consider ironically, by the CIA. There's a statue of her right in front of the CIA building, which I'm not sure she would necessarily embrace, given the history of what we know about what the CIA has done. But she played that kind of role. Now, the other thing about that role is that she then, after the war, fought for a pension. Pensions were given to Confederate soldiers. These were individuals who tried to overthrow the country and succeed from the country. They were given pensions. So she legitimately applied for a pension because she really was contracted. She wasn't just doing it out of, she was doing it out of, she needed and wanted to, but she also was contracted. It took decades and decades. Finally, it was a congressional act that ended up giving her a pension. Was more a widow's pension for a second husband who had been in the military. And that pension was $20 a month. So, that's an irony to look at. But she was, again, multi-talented individual that interacted in every single moment in her life and in each era, moving and trying to do the right thing.
I mentioned earlier in the conversation about the far right think tank manipulation of geography, of information, disinformation, erasure, and the relationship that it has with popular culture. Now, oscillating between these two world historical figures, Harriet Tubman and Andrew Jackson, we find that Andrew Jackson, within the popular culture, but also within the academy to a great extent, is handled with a pretty light touch. I mean, they handle this, we'll just call him a leader for now. To what he led, I'll hand that to you to be more specific. But this phenomenon is part of the destruction of the cultural fabric of the United States itself, isn't it? I mean, when we allow someone like Andrew Jackson, or more recently Hamilton, to be celebrated and revered for things that they absolutely in life stood against, attempted to corrupt, led absolute unrelenting violence towards, we're doing damage to the entire society and the entire nation, aren't we?
Oh, absolutely. And it's no accident that Jackson ends up celebrated and ends up on the $20 bill. He was on other bills. There's statues to Jackson kind of all over. As many people know, when Trump became president, one of the first things he did was to put a portrait of Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office to the right of the Oval. And if you look at pictures of Trump signing bills and such, you often see Andrew Jackson there on the wall.
Mm.
And Trump went to Andrew Jackson's home in Tennessee. And it's not surprising because the language in which Trump understands Andrew Jackson is very much consistent with his own narcissism and his own kind of brutal way of dealing with relationships and his antagonism to rules and laws and policies and norms, which is what Jackson was known for after he became president. He simply ignored Congress when he felt like it. He ignored Supreme Court decisions when he felt like it. So that certainly fit in. Now, Trump didn't, I would say Trump probably not read a single page about Andrew Jackson, but there were people around him who understood the image and identity that Jackson could bring that Trump could use for the base that he's been trying to build, which is, again, in complete opposition to Harriet Tubman.
That's right. That's right. Now, I don't want to overlook one of the most important words here in the title of your new book, again, $20 and change, and that is democracy, which in the history of the United States and its relationship to African America, to Blacks in America, has been a very much a two-faced proposition, Jekyll and Hyde, principle and interest, you know, the struggle, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, this kind of thing. And there are political thinkers today who reject outright the participation in electoral politics. I'm thinking of people whom we respect, like Frank B. Wilderson, for instance, or Joshua Clover. How do you respond to that position? I mean, obviously you have a view, and you'll correct me if I mischaracterize this, that is closer, I think, perhaps to someone like Vincent Harding, where we talk about the deepening of American democracy, his phrase, in terms of some of the goals of SCLC and voter rights registration drives and freedom rides in the 60s. Could you respond to the rejection of electoral politics as a means towards Black self-determination? How do you receive those thoughts from people, even those whom we respect a great deal?
So I'm not unsympathetic to the frustrations and critiques that I think people have about electoral politics, and that there's no way you can look at the broad history of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party and not see ways in which for decades they were compromised and played central roles in the oppression of Black people. But democracy isn't defined just by those two political parties or their entities. And it very much has been central to African Americans to marry electoral politics and movement politics and not really see a wall or an either or kind of circumstance. And again, let me quote Harriet Tubman. In 1913, when she was dying, she was in her last week of life, and there was a very important march coming up in Washington, D.C. For suffrage. This was one of the most important marches that occurred during that time and really was central to leading to the passage of the 19th Amendment. In that march, Black women were mobilizing to come. and there had been a back and forth. There were some white women who wanted Black women to march at the back of that march. And there was resistance. People like Ida B. Wells said, yeah, I'm not going to do that. And marched, where she was supposed to march. Harriet Tubman, literally about a week or so before she passed, was talking with one of the Black leaders, Mary Talbert, who was one of the women who was leading in the suffrage movement, one of the founders of the Niagara movement. And some of her last words were, quote, "Tell the women to stand together, for God would not forsake us." Now, she literally is dying, but she understood that the suffrage movement would apply at some point to Black people as a whole and to Black women, and that was important. And so that movement has been there throughout the history of Black politics. Now, I have a personal story on that because my grandmother was very active around this issue in Birmingham and Bessemer, Alabama. And she marched with King on the Pettus Bridge on those 3 different marches. And I grew up with the stories of her talking about the importance of that. She passed away at the age of 101, but up until her end of her life, she saw that as a critical, important part of Black people being able to push for rights and freedoms and all of that. So I get it. I completely understand the frustrations that people have, but it is a means by which we can also advance the struggle of Black people. And it means not surrendering to the forces of anti-democracy and even fascism that are on the move, one of which is through the vehicle of disenfranchisement and taking over government through non-democratic means.
One of the things that is consistently ignored within the so-called mainstream of American politics is what is actually an extraordinary diversity of opinion within Black America. This recently was shown quite vividly in the wake of the George Floyd protests, with the generation of what were alleged to be anti-racist reading lists, but one who is familiar with publishing and Black literature and scholarship would immediately note that with few exceptions, almost all those books were books that were newly published or published within the last 5 years. And conspicuously absent were Black intellectuals and scholars who, like Albert Murray, like Melvin B. Tolson, like George Schuyler, may have had a more conservative bent. And where I'm going with that is that one of the most brilliant and buoyant chapters in your new book, $20 and Change, has to do with symbolism. Symbolism, not just on the currency, but how it's used as a language, right, here in the United States. Now, again, centering on this oscillation between Jackson and Tubman, the popular culture in the United States, the consumerist, advertising-driven culture, has always exploited and degraded, appropriated, imitated, mimicked, and memed significant struggle and figures of struggle within Black America. So obviously, getting back to the diversity of opinion, which is so rarely represented within, corporate streams of media, how does one approach this particular issue on Tubman, but the larger spectrum of issues invited in it? Because it happens over and over and over again, and yet the pushback against it is infrequent. So you address it in the book, but could you address some of that for us today? The use or misuse of symbols and signs of Black freedom struggle, and how that falls within this particular dynamic of the question on the currency.
Thank you. So symbols are important. They're mobilizing, they're educational, there are narratives about society and life. And who controls what symbols are presented has significant control over other areas of life. So symbolism isn't separate from power, it is a critical component of it. And the resistance that we saw, for example, to changing symbols, to getting rid of statues and other monuments and acclaims to segregationists, to Confederates, to white supremacists, is challenged because they were put there for a reason. And that reason was to accent and to embellish and to foster the power relations that exist in society. So it's really critical that there are alternatives and counter narratives to these symbols. But it also takes the place of whose voices are chosen to be heard. So for example, I think it was over the summer, Biden had historians in to talk about the dangers of democracy and kind of where the country is at. Not one single historian of color. And this completely counters the entire history of the country, where people of color have really been at the forefront of advocating, fighting for, dying for democracy. And so that just kind of underscores the voices that have to be in the room, the voices that have to be given an opportunity for those narratives, those counter narratives that play a very different kind of role than what we normally see. And so I think the movement in the 2020, where the changing of names of buildings and streets and getting rid of statues didn't start in 2020. There's a long, long history of resistance by Native people, other people of color, against all of these really white supremacist authoritarian symbols that, again, are not disconnected from power relations in society.
And just to emphasize a particular aspect of that equation, I mean, the Confederacy was a declared enemy of the United States of America. What other nation on earth builds statues and celebrates their declared enemies? But I want to.
But I would add on that too. Not only built statues and monuments and named buildings and streets and such, also did not make those who committed that pay a price. The leaders of the Confederacy after the Civil War were essentially left to go and retire and enjoy their life however they chose to do it. That, of course, creates the conditions under which then you rewrite what actually happened during the Civil War. That it wasn't about slavery, it was about an overreaching government, that it was about states' rights, when in fact it was about slavery. But we battled that because the forces who led that were not purged and did not pay the consequences of what they tried to do.
There was no de facto denazification committee, in other words. And that led us to the point where that produced a person like Strom Thurmond, like Jesse Helms, like these others who are in power today. Yeah. Well, I know we have some folks who are eager to ask you some questions, so I'll bring our portion of the program around full circle and then invite Peter to return to read some of those questions. But at the beginning of this conversation, as I was introducing you and your book, I mentioned that we find ourselves historically in a situation that is not unlike triage, like battlefield triage, and I described your book $20 and change as being very much what I perceive as a kind of laying on of the hands to wounds, to very sacred wounds, and that as your reader, what I gathered was medicinal impulses on your part that led to the creation, the research, and the structure and writing of this book. So before we pivot to folks who have questions for you, Clarence, could we talk a little bit about that? Am I intuiting this correctly? Or were there some medicinal impulses on your part to bring about this extraordinary work?
So part of this was also to teach my son about not only Harriet Tubman, but Black female leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and at the time he was 6 or 7, when I was working on this, but I wanted him to not only kind of honor his great grandmother, but also to be someone who really did think deeply about history, did think deeply about looking at, how this country has evolved. So there, so there was a personal reason in trying to write this book in a particular kind of way and to honor all the people that are mentioned in the book who have played these, these really important roles, some well known, some not known at all, right. But who, again, are critical in the story that has to be told and what all of that means. And again, all of this comes, centered, doesn't center, but emerges out of this discussion about Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill and, the range of views on that. So the book looks at people who are in opposition to that as well, not just your traditional conservatives who knee-jerk opposition, but even among African Americans, including progressives, who have a range of views from fear of exploitation and performative anti-racism all the way across to recognizing and applauding and happy that Harriet Tubman will be replacing, at least on the front, Andrew Jackson.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we're coming in on the last quarter hour, so Peter over there at the bookstore, I'll invite you to rejoin and read from some of the questions in the chat. And again, I want to extend my thanks to you, Clarence, for your generosity with us this evening.
Sure.
So Lucy likens Trump being free to walk among us as a walking Confederate statue. Folks, please do post your questions in the chat. That is how we're going to be receiving questions tonight. Actually, I have a question in terms of how you structured the book and how you pulled in threads of your work, of your life's work to kind of bring it together. Could you talk a little bit about just process and bringing together such an amazing book?
Okay, thank you. First, just let me say, I think Lucy's absolutely right. Trump needs to be held accountable. Trump and everybody that organized the effort to overthrow the government. When you do not hold accountable those kind of behaviors, they do not go away. They do not disappear. They metastasize, they grow, and they continue. There should absolutely be accountability. In terms of the book, I approach my writing as a storyteller, and that I try to kind of blend not only the stories I uncover as I do research, but how does that fit in with kind of my own experiences here in the US and my global experiences and my family experiences. And so the book is kind of, weaves those sort of in and out. For example, I talk about the high school that I went to. I went to a high school in Detroit that was very famous and very iconic. It was a top school, and it was named after what we knew at the time, former governor of Michigan. So yeah, okay, whatever. But then discovered recently, as did many others, that this was somebody who was also in Andrew Jackson's administration and had been central to the development of the Indian Removal Act, which was the policy in the 1830s. Even though it was rejected by the Supreme Court, Andrew Jackson ignored it, and it initiated this mass and violent removal of Native Americans, ultimately leading to the Trail of Tears. This individual should not have a school named after him, particularly in Detroit, where the school is about 90% African American. He was a slave owner as well. Let me add that in there. So again, once you know, you have to do something. You can't unknow. So, you know, we didn't know when I was in school. We would have protested and demonstrated at the time. But once you do know, you at least have to raise your voice along those lines. And so that's what I tried to, again, incorporate into the writing.
We have a question from Audrey. Do you see Harriet Tubman as a Maroon or as an abolitionist or as both?
Both and more. I've taken to call her an agent of democracy because she really, you know, I thought when you step back and look at, you know, all that she was doing and all she was, you know, putting her life on the line for, it really was to create a very genuine, inclusive, multiracial, multi-gendered democracy. And she was willing to fight for that. She knew every important figure from the 1840s to when she died, and they knew her. John Brown, for example, who led effort in 1859 at Harper's Ferry to try to ignite a uprising of people who were enslaved. She had been considered and was considering being part of that. For various reasons, she wasn't able to. But when she opened up her home for the aged and infirm, one of the rooms was named after John Brown. So she reached back to that legacy to make it clear that this is where she stood. She wasn't backing down at all on that. And so, you know, that's where, you know, you see just the power of this woman, again, throughout her entire life.
Let's see. Any more questions, folks? Now is the time to ask. Justin, do you have any reflections while we're waiting for some more to trickle through?
Yeah, you know, Clarence, we were talking just a few moments ago about the use or misuse of imagery, symbols that emerge from Black struggle as they make their way into advertising, consumer, and commercial culture. One of the areas of controversy surrounding the Andrew Jackson, Harriet Tubman question, which you explore in your book. But I would like to expand that a little bit to areas that I think are probably more familiar to all of us, not just here in the United States, but internationally. And that has to do with the question of Black music. Now, the question of Black music in the Americas, no one, even the most dyed-in-the-wool racist, would refute that it has expansively changed the character of international art over the last 100 years. Easily the most productive and expansive agent of influence over the art of the last 100 years. But my point being this, is that just as with these images and symbols of Black struggle, oftentimes the messages and the meaning within the poetry and the music, once it makes its way outside of Black culture, once it makes its way onto recordings, records, and is distributed, the original meaning is often completely lost. And what I mean by that is that the use of code language, of double, triple, quadruple entendre, the mastery of tonal language to imply or suspend meaning, All of these are things that characterize Black music and poetry, going back to Paul Laurence Dunbar, We Wear the Mask, right up to Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, The Tracks of My Tears. This is a very serious problem, and it's touched on, obviously, with the struggle that you illuminate here. But could you offer some thoughts on the more expansive and larger picture of the conflict that I'm describing?
Okay, so another little secret of my writing. So everything I write, especially all the books I write, there's always a music angle
Right.
that I throw in there. So, when I wrote the Black History of the White House, there's a whole chapter on Black music at the White House. And
Right.
when, Duke Ellington played there. I wrote a book on drugs and talked about the blues songs that came out around drugs from African Americans in the 1920s and 1930s. So in this book, I also talk about there are groups that play music to Harriet Tubman, right? So music is really, to me, very telling of the ways in which there are multiplicity of arenas of struggle and arenas of resistance. And so we see this with the spread of the music around the world. So jazz, of course, comes to the rest of the world in the coming out of World War I, right? The international collapse of the world order becomes the opening door for jazz to end up in France and in Germany and in Europe. Hip hop played a similar kind of role starting in the 1970s and 80s of spreading around the world, but then being appropriated for the kind of resistance and the struggles that people had in their own circumstances and situations. So you get this, again, multiple layered appropriation and use of the music, sometimes as directly imitative, other times as completely reworked, but all legitimate in my eyes, because music becomes, again, one of these vehicles for which people express their aspirations, their hopes, and their forms of resistance to being marginalized and being oppressed.
Cornelius has a question. Any reflections on the cinematic portrayals of Harriet Tubman?
Yeah, so they pretty much limit her to what happened during the slave era. The last film that came out called Harriet stops with the Combahee River military mission that Justin and I were talking about earlier. So that would leave you with a strong impression of what challenges and what she did during that period, but it also freezes her, and that to me is a problem, because then you don't get the broader sense of what she was doing, as we talked about, around these other issues and concerns, or how she had to struggle, even though she played such an important role in the abolitionist movement, in the freedom, in the Underground Railroad movement, and in the Civil War. But she had financial issues for decades, which never should have happened, given what she had accomplished and what she had done. But none of that is there in those films about her. It's kind of creating a hero, but without context, and with a very narrowly constructed narrative.
I think we have time for one more question. Rachel states, at a time and Martin Luther King was supporting the human rights movement, decolonization in Africa showed great promise for an enforceable declaration of economic and social rights that might be needed to genuinely respect political and civil rights. But this movement was largely sidelined, and here we are today with the US being party to very few international human rights conventions. Are you optimistic about a contemporary Pan-African Black human rights movement taking the lead in the international human rights movement?
Mhm.
So that's a great question. So I would argue that Pan-Africanism has two forms. It has the capital P, capital A formal movement, in which there are declarative statements about being Pan-Africanist. And some of that certainly still exists. But I would argue there's a more smaller form of Pan-Africanism where it's engaging in the international arena and keeping these links and keeping these ties alive. And I speak with this bit very personally because this is much of what I do. I teach international relations focused on racial justice and human rights. And so I direct our program of international affairs at Howard University. And so I'm always trying to put students on planes and sending them everywhere in the world so that they can begin this kind of engagement and experience. And then my own work takes me to Europe, to Asia, to Latin America, and to Africa. So I don't see a wall between these movements, and there are lots and lots of African Americans, again, some in networks and in organizations and nonprofits and groups, others at more kind of individual action type of work that's going on. And it's probably not as much in the broader political discussion of Black politics, but all of that is certainly going on. And your question is really relevant as now we're in an era where the ability to communicate and network is so facilitated by the technologies that we have today that it really helps facilitate this work.
Well, we are at the top of the hour. Thank you both for an enlightening, very erudite evening. Thank you, Justin, for doing the honors. You kept it going along really smooth. Dr. Lusane, congratulations. It has been a pleasure and an honor to be able to publish your book and to have you here with us tonight. Also want to express our gratitude to all of you in the audience for joining us. As always, you help complete the circle. Also want to remind everybody this event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, through public events like this one, our publishing program, and educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So take care, everyone. Hope to see you all again soon. Dr. Lusane, I will leave you with the last word.
So, again, I want to thank everyone. Again, it's important to me to be able to have exchanges and discussions and to engage and to get feedback from everyone. So thank you. Everybody have a great break and a great holiday. And thank you, City Lights.